Welcome back to our exploration of Shema Kolenu. Yesterday, we looked at the variety of different versions of this blessing that appear in Jewish tradition in different communities, both currently and across time. And we're going to have an opportunity now to dive in sort of more line by line into the bracha. We're going to start with the sort of curious place of why do we ask God to Shema Kolenu, to listen to our voice, as opposed to listen to our prayer. And I just want to sort of strengthen that question by, I'm going to share the screen so you can see what I think is sort of unusual about this blessing is the way in which you might have expected it to say that God should hear our prayer, but instead it says God should hear our voice. And what does it mean for God to hear our voice? What is that referring to, or what might it refer to? Okay, so again, we start off this blessing by saying, Shema Kolenu, listen to our voice. And that may seem totally obvious to us, but probably because just we're familiar with this blessing. What I'm noticing, and I bolded this throughout the prayer, is that the other times that the word lishmoa, to hear, comes in the prayer, which is not as insignificant number of times, it's always connected to tefillah. Ki el Shomei'a tefillot, because you are the God who listens to prayers. And in Nusach Sfard, Chonenu v'anenu ushma tefillatenu, listen to our prayers. Ki ata Shomei'a tefillat, either tefillat kolper, tefillat amcha, Yisrael. So listening to prayers as the penultimate line. And then the blessing is, Baruch atah Hashem Shomei'a tefillah. Blessed are you, God, who listens to prayer. So I'm just sort of heightening the oddity of the fact that the prayer opens with Shema Kolenu as opposed to something like Shema Tefillatenu. And we have another example of this sort of in historical time in the Eretz Yisrael tradition that was discovered in the Geniza. It essentially does say that Shema Adonai Eloheinu B'kol Tefillatenu is how it opens. Listen to the voice of our prayer. So voice is there, the word kol is there, but it's clear that the word tefillah is sort of the main operative word here. And then it makes sense that the blessing ends, Shomei'a tefillah, who hears prayer. So I'm just coming back to the question of what does it mean for God to listen to our voice? If you might have expected God to listen to our prayer, and what is the distinction between listening to a voice versus listening to a prayer or listening to the voice of prayer? Shema Kolenu is something to to ask about, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And if you look through the Tanakh, and those of you who study with me know that my method is to look back into the Tanakh and see where the Siddur is quoting from. If you just check the number of places where God listens to a kol, God listens to a voice in the Bible, it's very, very unusual. What's more usual is we, the children of Israel, listening to God's voice, or individuals listening to God's voice, either narratively or as an instruction, like following God's rules. But God listening to our voice is actually fairly unusual. And we're going to look at that over the next couple of days. We're going to start with the one that's sort of most obvious that it's referring to, and the Siddur commentators that we've looked at in the past, the Ribar Yakar and Abu Draham, both point to this as the intertext, as the text that the Siddur is referring to. This is a text that may be familiar to you because we were reciting it on Seder night, on Pesach, and this is the place where God listens to our voice. This is the scene is from Deuteronomy 26, which is the scene in which we recite at the bringing of the first fruits. We're actually counting our way there with the Omer, and this is when you get to the end of the counting cycle. You bring your first fruits and you say before the Kohen, before the priest, "Va'anita v'amarta lefanav lifnei Adonai Elohecha, Arami Oved Avi." My father was a wandering Aramean, or an Aramean tried to destroy my father. And then we tell the story. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. Vanitzak el Adonai Elohei Avotenu. We cried out, we screamed out to Adonai, the God of our ancestors. Vayishma Adonai et kolenu. and God heard our voice. This is the place in the Torah where God hears our voice. So Shema Kolenu is a reference to the moment in our history when we were suffering at the hands of the Egyptians. We cried out, we screamed out, and God heard our cry, heard our voice. So this voice is not just sort of like a mellifluous, recitation of prayers. It's a desperate plea that comes from people who are suffering. That's the call. That's the voice that God hears. And what, as a result of hearing, what does God do? God sees all of the suffering that we're going through. And then, of course, God takes us out from Egypt. And if you follow through that section of Devarim, then you see the farmer who's bringing his first fruits ends this declaration by saying, of these fruits, I haven't eaten any of them while mourning. I have not cleared out any of it while I was unclean, and I have not deposited any of it with the dead, all the things you're not supposed to do with your first fruits that you might be tempted to do. Rather, Shamati B'kol Adonai Elohai. Rather, I have listened to the voice of Hashem, my God. Asiti K'chol Asher Tzivitani. I've done everything you commanded. So there's sort of a twin here. God listens to our voice, and we listen to God's voice, all in that section of the story of our redemption from Egypt. So what you see here is when we say Shema Kolenu, as opposed to Shema Tefillatenu, there is a reference to this great moment of suffering in our past, and also this twin sort of almost like a covenant of, if you listen to our voice, we, of course, will listen to your voice. And the relationship of, a lot of things we talked about in the Amidah, previously, all the things that we are trying to do better at, like tshuva and slicha, all the things that we want, to behave better with God. That's perhaps the mirror image of God listening to our voice. God listens to our voice, we listen to God's voice. And this voice is a moment of sort of national dread and suffering that we're sort of transferring to this moment in prayer, again, stated in the plural, which could refer to our own prayers, like Shomei'a Tefillah is definitely a part of this blessing, but the opener is Shema Kolenu, hear the cry that comes from our sort of national suffering that we're going through, sort of modeled on that original national suffering in Egypt. Now, this connection between Shema Kolenu, our prayer, and God listening to us suffering in Egypt and redeeming us comes through in a couple other places, which I just wanted to show you. So I'm scrolling on to the last page. First of all, we quote this selection of verses from Deuteronomy chapter 26 in the Haggadah, and then we do a midrash on those verses. So the section of the Haggadah that works with this phrase, Vayishma Adonai et Kolenu, God heard our voice, that's the quote from Deuteronomy. The Haggadah takes us to another text in Exodus, Kimash Ne'emar. What is this referring to? God heard our voice. So it takes us in Exodus to Vayishma Elohim et Na'akatam. Here it's not kol, the word isn't voice, but it's their moaning, their na'aka. It's like the aleph and the nun sometimes switch. So it's like anacha, anaka. They're moaning, they're groaning. God heard their groaning, and God remembers the covenant. So God hears and God remembers, and as a result, God acts. So that's taking us back in the story into the sort of the original version of the story in Exodus 2. And I sort of brought you these verses here just so we can see them. The king, this is a little bit confusing, but the king who was originally, pressuring us and making us suffer died. They were sighing, groaning under the bondage. They cried out, ze'aka, that's the word we're looking at. We saw in Deuteronomy as well. They cried out, they screamed out, and that cry went up to God, that came out from their bondage, from their avodah. And then Vayishma Elohim et Na'akatam. So God hears their mourning, and then God remembers and God acts. Now, if you remember from yesterday, we actually saw a reference to this hearing in some versions of our blessing. Ushema na'akatenu, ka'asher shamata et na'akat avotenu. That is an addition that in the ancient version of the Bavel tradition shows up. God is hearing our na'aka, our moaning, which takes us again, sort of in an intertext journey, straight to the moment where we're crying out from our suffering in Egypt. And indeed, a late midrash which connects each of the blessings of the Amidah to a narrative point in the history of the Jewish people recognizes this as well, and says, when Israel was moaning and they screamed out to God, and God heard their cries, as it says, that's the verse we just saw. Miyad, what happened in that moment when God heard their cries of suffering in Egypt? Then the ministering angels said or wrote or sort of innovated this blessing, Baruch atah Hashem Shomei'a Tefillah. Blessed are you, God, who hears prayer. So again, the linking between our bracha of Shema Kolenu and that moment in time when God heard our original voice, our original crying out that came as a result of our suffering in Egypt, is one of the things that's standing behind this bracha. And what we're going to look at going forward this week is other intertexts, other connections that are being drawn out from this blessing. But today we're starting with our suffering in Egypt and the cries that came out of that moment, twinned with our opportunity to listen to God's voice as a result of God listening to us.